Good evening. I'm Mr. Norman Pepper, and tonight we step quietly into the warm, smoky world of the steam railway fireman. Not the famous express driver leaning proudly from the cab window, nor the station master with his polished watch and brass buttons, but the younger man beside the firebox door. The man with coal dust in the folds of his coat. The man whose work was hot, repetitive, exhausting, and almost entirely unseen by the passengers asleep in their compartments behind him. Part 1. Signing on before dawn. Tonight, we will spend a slow and unhurried night beside him. We will walk through dark railway yards before dawn. We will hear the clink of metal tools against steel footplates. We will stand in engine sheds filled with drifting steam and yellow lamplight. We will shovel coal into glowing fireboxes while rain taps softly against the roof of the cab. And together we will follow the quiet rhythm of a steam locomotive travelling through the sleeping countryside while most of the world rests indoors. But before we begin, I will be most grateful if you would leave a comment and let me know from where in the world you are listening tonight. So, settle comfortably now, and let us begin. The fireman's day often began when most other people were still asleep. In winter, especially, he might leave his home in complete darkness, stepping quietly through silent streets with frost whitening the cobbles beneath the weak glow of gas lamps. The town around him would still belong to bakers, milkmen, dock workers, and railwaymen. Curtains remained drawn across windows. Chimneys showed no smoke yet. Even the public houses had fallen silent hours earlier. A railway fireman was usually younger than the driver he worked beside. Many began as engine cleaners in their teenage years, wiping oil from wheels, polishing brass fittings, and learning the complicated moods and habits of locomotives simply by standing nearby and watching older men work. Promotion came slowly. A cleaner might spend years inside a locomotive shed before being trusted with a shovel and the responsibility of keeping a locomotive alive during a journey, and alive truly was how many railwaymen thought of their engines. Steam locomotives breathed, they hissed, they sweated, they groaned awake reluctantly in the cold mornings. Their metal frames clicked and shifted as heat expanded through them. Railwaymen often spoke of a good locomotive almost as though it possessed a personality. Some engines steamed freely and seemed eager for the road. Others behaved stubbornly, refusing to raise steam properly no matter how carefully the fire was managed. The fireman learned all of this slowly. By the time he reached the engine shed, the air itself had already changed. Even from outside, there would be the smell of wet soot, warm oil, coal smoke, and damp steam drifting into the darkness above the rooftops. Large shed doors stood partly open, and from within came the muffled sounds of locomotives preparing for another day's work. Metal clanged against metal somewhere in the shadows. A distant injector hissed sharply. Boots echoed across concrete floors blackened by decades of smoke and ash. Inside the shed, engines waited side by side beneath great iron roofs stained dark by soot. Some rested silently, fires dropped and boilers cold. Others were already awake, breathing softly through safety valves while thin streams of steam curled upward into the rafters. Everything inside the shed seemed to glow dimly through haze. Yellow lamps reflected in puddles beneath the locomotives. Firelight flickered briefly whenever a firebox door swung open somewhere down the line of engines. Men moved through the drifting steam, carrying oil cans, shovels, lamps, and long iron tools. Nobody wasted energy speaking loudly at this hour. Railway sheds possessed their own strange quietness. Even when busy, they never entirely lost the feeling of a place still half asleep. The fireman's first task was preparation. Long before passengers boarded trains, before signals cleared, before whistles echoed across the countryside, the locomotive itself had to be made ready. Water levels needed checking, fire irons had to be inspected. Coal loaded into the tender needed breaking into manageable pieces. Lubrication points required attention. Ash from the previous shift might still need clearing beneath the fire grate. The locomotive driver usually handled certain mechanical inspections, while the fireman concentrated upon steam and fire. And always at the center of everything there was the firebox. To modern eyes, it can seem surprising that an enormous machine capable of pulling hundreds of tons depended so completely upon one contained coal fire. Yet that glowing chamber beneath the boiler was the very heart of steam railway travel. Without careful firing, the locomotive lost strength. Steam pressure would fall, speed dropped, schedules failed. A badly managed fire could exhaust both engine and crew. The fireman's labor therefore became a constant balancing act between heat, oxygen, water, steam pressure, fuel economy, and physical endurance. He opened the heavy firebox door. Instantly, orange light burst across the cab interior. Even on cold mornings, the sudden heat could feel astonishing. Inside the firebox, coal burned upon grates in fierce white-orange layers, while air roared beneath through carefully controlled dampers. The sound itself resembled a living thing breathing deeply in the darkness. Firemen learned to judge conditions almost instinctively from color alone. A dull fire signaled trouble. Bright, evenly distributed fire meant healthy steam production. Then came the shoveling. Contrary to how films sometimes portray it, firing was not simply a matter of throwing coal endlessly into the flames. Skill mattered enormously. Coal needed spreading carefully across different sections of the grate to maintain even combustion. Too much coal in one area smothered airflow. Too little created cold spots and reduced steam production. Every railway company developed slightly different firing methods, and experienced crews often possessed strong opinions about correct technique. The work itself was deeply physical. A fireman might shovel several tons of coal during a single shift. The cab floor vibrated continuously beneath his boots, while heat from the firebox roasted one side of his body and cold night air entered through the open cab behind him. His arms, shoulders and back learned the repetitive movement of lifting and swinging the shovel with mechanical efficiency. And still the train had not yet moved. Outside the shed, dawn remained distant. Somewhere beyond the railway yard, ordinary houses still slept peacefully while this hidden industrial world prepared itself in darkness. The railway existed almost like a separate nocturnal society, operating beside the sleeping towns and villages of Britain. Once sufficient steam pressure built within the boiler, the engine slowly came fully alive. Valves hissed louder, gauges trembled into position. Condensation drifted from cylinders in thick white clouds. Somewhere ahead, another locomotive released a sharp whistle that echoed across the rooftops and disappeared into the cold morning air. The driver climbed into the cab and glanced at the gauges. The fireman wiped soot from his hands onto already blackened overalls. Soon they would leave the shed. Soon they would back carefully onto their train, waiting somewhere among dark sidings and signal lamps. And then, while countless passengers slept warmly in beds beyond the railway embankments, the fireman would begin the long, invisible labor of carrying them through the night. For now, though, the locomotive simply breathed quietly beneath the great roof of the shed, gathering strength in the darkness while drifting steam curled slowly upward like pale clouds disappearing into shadow. Part 2. Leaving the shed. Eventually, there came the moment when the locomotive could no longer remain quietly inside the engine shed. Steam pressure had risen steadily toward working level. The fire glowed evenly across the grate. Water sat correctly within the boiler glass. Oil had been applied to bearings and motion. The driver had completed his inspections, signed the necessary papers, and exchanged a few brief words with the shed foreman. Now the engine was ready for the road. Outside, the night still lingered over the railway yard. In winter months especially, a fireman might begin his working day long before sunrise, moving from darkness into more darkness still. Yet the railway possessed its own strange illumination. Signal lamps glowed red and green through the mist. Yard lamps painted pale reflections across wet rails. Steam drifted beneath the lights in soft rolling clouds, turning the entire depot into a world of shifting shadows and blurred shapes. The driver leaned from the cab window and gave a short whistle. Somewhere ahead, points clanked heavily into position. Then, with a gentle release of steam and a slow metallic tug felt through the footplate beneath their boots, the locomotive eased itself forward out of the shed. Even this simple movement carried a certain ceremony to it. Locomotives never truly moved silently. There were always sounds: the soft chuff of exhaust from the cylinders, the squeal of flanges against curved rails, the clicking rhythm of connecting rods beginning their motion, water bubbling faintly within the boiler, coal shifting in the tender behind the cab. The fireman stood beside the firebox door, steadying himself as the engine rolled across points and crossings toward the sidings. Ahead, dozens of rails disappeared into darkness beneath drifting steam. The railway yard spread outward like a metal city, full of sleeping wagons, empty platforms, signal cabins, water towers, coal stages, and silent lines stretching into the countryside beyond. To outsiders, railway yards often appeared chaotic, but railwaymen understood every siding, every signal arm, every junction and crossover instinctively. Even in darkness, experienced crews knew precisely where they were, simply from gradients, landmarks, and the feel of the locomotive beneath them. The engine moved slowly now. There was no hurry yet. A steam locomotive leaving the shed coldly and violently was considered poor practice. Machines, like people, needed time to wake properly. Metal expanded gradually as heat spread through pipes, valves, and cylinders. Lubricating oil warmed and thinned. Even the crew themselves settled slowly into the rhythm of work. The fireman used these quieter moments carefully. Already he was thinking ahead. A good fireman constantly planned for future demands upon the engine. Steam, once lost, could not instantly be recovered. Heavy gradients, long climbs, fast running, station departures, and difficult weather all required anticipation. Firemen therefore developed the habit of thinking miles ahead down the line rather than focusing only upon the present moment. He opened the firebox once more. The glow inside painted the cab walls deep orange. Shadows jumped across the driver's face before the door clanged shut again. With practiced movements, the fireman spread several shovels of coal carefully across the burning bed, aiming not at the center alone, but toward corners and edges where thinner areas might develop. Then he closed the dampers slightly. Too much air rushing through the fire could waste fuel and pull sparks uselessly through the tubes. Too little air would suffocate combustion. Everything depended upon balance. And balance itself became one of the hidden themes of railway firing. Balance between heat and fuel, between steam pressure and water level, between physical strength and endurance, between speed and economy. Passengers rarely considered any of this. Most saw only the polished locomotive at the front of the platform, perhaps trailing white steam dramatically beneath station lamps. They heard whistles and watched clouds drift upward into the night sky. But few understood the endless labor occurring inside the cab itself. Even fewer realized how physically punishing the work could become. The cab of a steam locomotive was not an enclosed, comfortable room. It was a partly open metal platform exposed constantly to weather, vibration, noise, heat and coal dust. In summer, temperatures beside the firebox could become unbearable. In winter, freezing winds entered through open cab sides, while sweat soaked the fireman's shirt from continual exertion. And all the while, the locomotive itself moved like a living machine beneath them. The engine rolled carefully past rows of parked freight wagons now, their wooden sides dark with rain and soot. Somewhere nearby, another crew prepared a locomotive for an early goods train. Briefly, through drifting steam, the fireman glimpsed another cab glowing orange from within like a lantern in the darkness. Across Britain, thousands of railwaymen once performed this same ritual every night. Some hauled express passenger trains between major cities. Others worked slow coal trains through industrial districts where furnace smoke already darkened the sky before dawn. Some spent entire nights shunting wagons endlessly within marshalling yards, never traveling more than a few miles, while coupling and uncoupling freight beneath harsh lamps and winter rain. Yet despite the variety of work, the atmosphere remained remarkably similar. There was always the smell of hot oil, always steam drifting through yellow light, always soot settling softly across clothing and skin, and always the sense that railwaymen inhabited a world operating slightly apart from ordinary daily life. The locomotive approached a water column. Even before beginning a journey, engines frequently required more water. Steam locomotives consumed astonishing quantities during operation, converting water into steam continuously while running. The tender behind the cab carried thousands of gallons, yet on long routes, crews still stopped regularly at trackside water cranes or towers. The driver brought the engine gently to a halt. The fireman climbed down first. Boots struck wet ballast beside the rails. Above him, the locomotive towered enormously in the darkness, warm metal ticking softly as steam curled from beneath the running boards. Up close, engines seemed less like polished museum pieces and more like hard-working industrial creatures. Their sides carried streaks of oil, soot, lime stains and weathering from constant use. The fireman swung the heavy water crane toward the tender hatch. Chains rattled, metal groaned. Then water thundered downward into the tank with enormous force. Steam mixed with spray beneath the yard lamps while the fireman watched carefully to avoid overflow. Nearby, the driver checked his watch against railway time. Precision mattered enormously on the railways. Entire networks depended upon schedules measured almost to the minute. At last, the tender filled. The crane swung back into place. The fireman climbed once more into the cab, already warmer here beside the firebox than outside in the damp night air. Ahead waited their train. Somewhere beyond the sidings, coaches stood ready beneath platform lamps, while a few sleepy passengers gathered with suitcases and newspapers. Porters wheeled luggage trolleys along the platform edge. Perhaps milk churns waited for loading into a van near the rear of the train. Somewhere, a station clock ticked steadily onward through the darkness. The locomotive moved forward again. This time, the journey truly began. Signals cleared one by one ahead of them, green lights shining through steam and mist. The rails curved gently toward the station throat, where dozens of tracks merged and separated like rivers crossing one another in darkness. The fireman took up his shovel once more. Soon they would leave the town behind. Soon the engine would settle into the long breathing rhythm of open running. And throughout the endless miles ahead, while farms, villages and sleeping houses passed silently beyond the embankments, the fireman would continue feeding the fire without pause, keeping alive the great glowing heart at the center of the locomotive. Part 3. Into the night. By the time the locomotive backed carefully onto its train, the station itself had begun to stir awake. Lamps burned beneath the platform canopy, reflecting softly upon damp paving stones, while thin streams of steam drifted along the carriage roofs. Porters moved quietly with barrows of luggage. Somewhere farther down the platform, a guard exchanged a few final words with the station master beneath the glow of a hanging clock. Yet even here, in this busier place, there remained a certain hush peculiar to railway stations at night. Voices stayed low. Footsteps echoed strangely beneath the iron roof. Newspapers rustled softly in gloved hands, while passengers climbed sleepily into compartments warmed faintly by carriage heaters. Some travellers were beginning long journeys northward through the darkness. Others merely travelled to nearby towns before dawn. A few sat already half asleep behind misted windows, scarcely glancing toward the locomotive waiting ahead. Most never saw the fireman at all. From the platform, people noticed perhaps the polished brass numbers on the engine, the white plume drifting upward into the cold air, or the driver leaning briefly from the cab. But the fireman remained largely hidden in shadow beside the firebox door, already sweating lightly despite the chill night air outside. For him, the real work was only beginning. The coupling clanked firmly into place behind them. Steam hissed beneath the wheels. The guard raised his lamp. And then, somewhere ahead in the darkness, the signal cleared. The driver answered with a whistle that echoed beautifully beneath the station roof. For a brief moment, everything seemed to pause together. Steam drifting motionless in the yellow light, passengers settling into their seats, railway staff watching from the platform edge. Then the locomotive pulled. At first, movement came gently. A heavy train never started all at once. Tension traveled gradually through the couplings from coach to coach behind the engine, each carriage tugging the next into motion with a succession of soft jolts, disappearing backward into the darkness. The fireman braced himself automatically against the sway of the cab floor. Outside, the station began sliding slowly away. Platform lamps passed one by one beside the cab. Waiting passengers disappeared into drifting steam. Signal boxes, sidings, warehouses and goods yards moved steadily backward as the locomotive gathered confidence and speed. Soon, the town itself faded behind them. The railway lines stretched forward now through cuttings, embankments and open countryside, silvered faintly beneath moonlight and mist. Telegraph poles rose and fell rhythmically beside the track. Far away, scattered farmhouse windows glowed softly across dark fields. Inside the cab, however, there existed an entirely different world. The firebox door opened with a metallic clang. Instant heat burst outward once more. The fireman worked steadily now, his movements already settling into the familiar rhythm railwaymen knew so well. Shovel forward. Coal lifted cleanly from the tender. Swing across the body. Firebox door open. Coal scattered precisely across the burning bed. Door shut again quickly to preserve heat and protect boiler pressure. Again, and again, and again. The work became almost hypnotic in its repetition. Every few moments the fireman glanced upward toward the pressure gauge mounted inside the cab. Steam pressure needed maintaining within careful limits. Too low and the locomotive lost power. Too high and safety valves would begin releasing precious steam wastefully into the night air. Meanwhile, the driver watched signals ahead while adjusting regulator and reverser to suit gradients and speed. Between the two men, conversation often remained surprisingly sparse. This was not from coldness, but from familiarity. Many engine crews worked together for years and developed an almost instinctive understanding of one another's habits. The driver sensed from the fireman's movements whether steam remained healthy. The fireman recognized from subtle changes in engine sound when heavier firing would soon become necessary. Words became less important than rhythm, and rhythm itself governed almost everything about steam railway life. There was rhythm in the turning wheels beneath them, rhythm in the exhaust beats rolling backward into darkness, rhythm in the swing of the shovel, rhythm in the careful opening and closing of dampers, injectors and fire doors. Even the railway track possessed rhythm, the rails joining beneath the wheels with endless repeating patterns carrying the locomotive onward through the sleeping countryside. The fireman leaned briefly from the cab side. Cold air struck his face instantly, refreshing after the fierce heat of the firebox. Sparks streamed backward from the chimney high above, vanishing into darkness behind the train. Alongside the track, hedgerows and telegraph poles flickered past in the moonlight, while occasional distant villages appeared briefly as clusters of warm yellow windows before disappearing once more. Many railwaymen later remembered these night journeys with enormous affection. Exhausting though the work could be, there was something strangely peaceful about traveling through sleeping landscapes while most of the world rested indoors. The railway seemed to belong temporarily to the locomotive crew alone. Roads remained mostly empty. Towns slept silently beneath church towers and factory chimneys. Only the engine moved steadily onward through the darkness, carrying its cargo of passengers, parcels, letters, newspapers, milk churns, and goods toward distant destinations. Inside the coaches behind them, passengers settled deeper into sleep as the motion of the train continued. Some compartments glowed softly beneath dim lamps. Others remained completely dark. The steady rocking movement of railway travel soothed many travelers almost immediately into unconsciousness. Curtains swayed gently beside windows blackened by night outside. Occasionally, a sleeping passenger might wake briefly as the train thundered through a station without stopping, platform lights flashing suddenly across compartment walls before vanishing once more into darkness. Few gave any thought to the men working at the front of the train, yet the fireman could never truly rest. Even on level stretches of track requiring less effort from the locomotive, his attention remained fixed constantly upon the fire. Steam engines possessed enormous appetites. Coal disappeared steadily into the glowing furnace while water levels shifted continuously within the boiler glass. And always there remained the danger of mistakes. Allow water levels to fall too low, and catastrophe became possible. Mismanage the fire badly, and steam production collapsed. Poor firing technique wasted fuel, damaged efficiency, and exhausted both engine and crew unnecessarily. Experienced firemen therefore learned to think ahead constantly. A rising gradient visible ahead in the moonlight meant preparing the fire early before the engine began climbing. Long descents required different handling altogether. Wet weather altered drafting conditions through the fire tubes. Even the quality of coal itself affected firing style. Not all coal burned equally. Some produced fierce heat quickly, other grades burned slower but longer. Certain coal created excessive smoke or clinker, hard stony deposits forming upon the grate which restricted airflow and reduced efficiency. Firemen became remarkably skilled at reading fuel conditions simply from flame color, smoke, and the feel of the engine beneath their feet. The locomotive thundered now across a low bridge spanning dark water below. For a moment, the sound changed completely, echoing hollow and metallic beneath the train before returning again to the softer rushing rhythm of open track. Ahead, another signal glowed green through the darkness. The driver adjusted the regulator slightly. The engine responded immediately, exhaust beats deepening into a stronger, sharper rhythm, while speed increased gently. The fireman, sensing the locomotive's growing appetite for steam, added fresh coal expertly across the firebed. Orange light flooded the cab again. Sweat shone briefly upon his forehead, despite the cold wind entering through the open cab side. His hands had already become blackened thoroughly with coal dust and soot. Tiny cinders occasionally drifted backward into the cab, stinging exposed skin or burning small holes into clothing. Railway work was never clean. By journey's end, soot settled into every fold of fabric, every crease of skin, every thread of the fireman's scarf and cap. And still the train pressed onward into the endless night. Behind them lay sleeping towns and stations already fading into memory. Ahead waited more signals, more gradients, more darkness, and many more hours beside the glowing firebox before dawn finally touched the rails with light. Part 4. The Long Climb. After an hour or two upon the road, the easy stretches of level running often gave way to more demanding country. Railway lines rarely travelled across perfectly flat land for long. Britain especially, with its rolling hills, river valleys and uneven landscapes, constantly tested both locomotive and crew. To passengers asleep inside warm compartments, these changes in gradient often passed unnoticed. But to the men upon the footplate, every incline announced itself immediately. The locomotive could feel it before the eye properly saw it. The engine's rhythm altered subtly beneath their feet. Exhaust beats deepened. Speed eased almost imperceptibly. The driver adjusted the regulator and reverser with small practiced movements while watching the line ahead carefully beneath the glow of signal lamps and moonlight. The fireman already knew what was coming. Long before the train actually reached the foot of the climb, he had begun preparing the fire. This was one of the great hidden skills of steam railway work. A locomotive could not simply summon power instantly like a modern diesel or electric engine. Steam had to be ready before it was needed. Boiler pressure must remain strong. The fire must burn evenly and fiercely across the grate. Water levels needed careful balancing so the boiler could generate steam efficiently without risking danger. Everything depended upon anticipation. The fireman opened the firebox door again. A violent white-orange glare burst outward, bright enough to hurt the eyes after prolonged darkness. Inside, the fire roared fiercely now, air rushing upward through the grate while flames curled through the tubes deep within the boiler. The heat striking the cab could feel almost unbearable, especially after standing moments earlier in cold night air blowing through the open cab sides. The fireman worked steadily and methodically. He did not simply throw coal wildly into the center of the flames. Instead, he built the fire carefully, maintaining thickness where needed and preventing weak spots from forming near corners or edges. The shovel moved almost continuously now. Lift, swing, spread, close the door, lift again. Coal dust floated through the cab with every movement. Sweat darkened the fireman's collar despite the freezing air outside. And slowly, steadily, the locomotive began its climb. The countryside around them changed too. Valleys narrowed. Embankments rose higher beside the track. cuttings sliced through dark hillsides where dripping stone walls flashed briefly past in the firelight spilling from the cab. Sometimes the locomotive entered tunnels where smoke and steam suddenly pressed back around the engine in choking clouds. Tunnels were among the hardest places for footplate crews. Passengers inside the train merely noticed darkness outside their windows and perhaps a slight smell of smoke entering the compartment. But upon the locomotive itself, conditions became vastly harsher. Exhaust blasted violently against tunnel roofs before swirling back toward the cab. Smoke thickened instantly around the crew. Sparks and soot filled the air while the roar of the engine became deafening within the enclosed space. The fireman often lowered his head instinctively and turned slightly away from the smoke. Eyes watered. Breathing became unpleasant. And still the shoveling continued. Then at last, the locomotive burst once more into open air beneath the night sky, trailing steam and smoke behind it, while cool wind swept briefly through the cab. The driver glanced toward the pressure gauge. The fireman had judged the climb correctly. This silent approval between railwaymen mattered more than praise spoken aloud. Footplate crews depended heavily upon trust. A driver needed confidence that his fireman could maintain steam under difficult conditions. The fireman, meanwhile, relied upon the driver's skill handling the locomotive safely through weather, signals, and changing track conditions. Many crews worked together so long that their movements became almost instinctive. One railwayman later described it as being like two men rowing the same boat in darkness. Each understood the other's rhythm without needing explanation. Outside the cab, the sleeping world rolled slowly past beneath moonlight. Farmhouses stood isolated upon distant hillsides, their windows glowing faintly amber across the fields. Occasionally the train passed small country stations where platform lamps burned silently beside empty benches and locked waiting rooms. Somewhere a signalman remained awake inside his elevated signal box, watching the train thunder past before returning once more to his levers, block instruments, and lonely overnight duties. Railways depended upon many unseen workers besides the locomotive crew: signalmen, plate layers, lampmen, porters, telegraph operators, maintenance gangs, shunters, night cleaners. All worked strange hours while much of the country slept. Together they maintained the vast moving system, allowing trains to travel safely through darkness, fog, snow, rain, and storm. Yet among them all, perhaps none performed more physically exhausting labor than the steam fireman. By now, the cab itself had become coated in fresh layers of grime from the journey. Coal fragments lay scattered across the floor plates. Fine black soot settled upon gauges, handrails, and clothing alike. The fireman's face shone with sweat streaked through coal dust, while his hands had long since disappeared beneath layers of black grime worked deep into the skin. And still, there remained many miles ahead. The climb steepened further. The locomotive answered with harder exhaust beats now, each one hammering sharply into the darkness ahead. Steam blasted upward from the chimney in powerful bursts, while sparks streamed backward above the coaches like fiery insects vanishing into the night. Inside the boiler, water churned violently as heat transferred through metal sheets and tubes. Every part of the machine worked at tremendous intensity now. Pistons drove connecting rods in flashing rhythms beside the wheels. Valves opened and closed thousands of times each minute. Bearings turned under enormous pressure, while the fire beneath the boiler consumed coal at astonishing speed. The fireman barely paused between shovelfuls. This was where physical endurance mattered most. A weak or careless fireman could ruin a climb entirely, allowing steam pressure to fall until the locomotive struggled helplessly upon the gradient. Railwaymen remembered such failures bitterly. Lost time upon steep banks affected schedules far down the line and embarrassed both driver and fireman alike. A skilled fireman, however, could make difficult work appear almost effortless. He learned how to build a bright fire that generated fierce heat without wasting fuel. He knew precisely when to add fresh coal and when to leave the fire alone to breathe properly. He understood how weather affected drafting and combustion. Above all, he developed stamina, the ability to continue shoveling steadily hour after hour, regardless of heat, exhaustion, or discomfort. At last, after what felt like an endless climb through darkness, the gradient began easing beneath them. The locomotive sensed relief almost immediately. Exhaust softened slightly. Speed steadied. The driver adjusted the controls with small economical movements, and for the first time in many minutes, the fireman allowed himself a brief pause beside the tender. Cold air drifted through the cab again, cooling sweat upon his forehead. Beyond the embankment, the land opened outward into broad, moonlit countryside. Far away, tiny villages rested silently among hedgerows and woods, while church towers rose black against the faint silver horizon. The train continued onward through the sleeping world. Behind them, the hard climb already faded into darkness and memory. Ahead still waited more miles, more signals, more stations, and many more hours beside the fire before dawn would finally arrive across the rails. Part 5. The Small Hours. There was a particular feeling known well to railwaymen who worked through the night, a feeling difficult to describe fully to those who slept ordinary hours indoors. It arrived during the small hours of the morning, sometime after midnight had passed, but long before dawn even hinted at the horizon. The world seemed to enter its deepest state of silence then. Roads emptied almost entirely. Towns darkened. Farmhouses showed only the occasional lonely windows still glowing across the fields. Even the railway itself felt quieter. The locomotive still roared and hammered onward, of course, but beyond the moving train there existed a strange emptiness, as though the rest of the country had withdrawn into sleep and left only the engine crew awake beneath the stars. For the firemen, these hours could feel both peaceful and immensely tiring. The first energy of the shift had long faded. Muscles began stiffening from constant work upon the swaying footplate. Coal dust clung damply to sweat-soaked clothing. The repetitive rhythm of shoveling, firing, checking gauges and trimming the fire continued without interruption, yet now fatigue slowly crept into every movement. Still, the work could not slow. A steam locomotive demanded constant attention, regardless of the hour. The fireman stood beside the tender, lifting fresh coal toward the firebox with steady, measured movements. By now, his body worked almost automatically. Experienced railwaymen often described entering a kind of rhythm during long journeys where actions repeated so many times they became nearly unconscious. The shovel moved with practiced economy. The firebox door opened only briefly to preserve draft and heat. Coal landed exactly where needed across the burning bed. No movement wasted energy. That mattered greatly after many hours upon the footplate. The driver, meanwhile, remained focused upon the line ahead. Signal lamps appeared and vanished steadily in the darkness, each carrying vital instructions governing speed and track conditions further along the route. Green for clear running, yellow for caution, red for danger and absolute stop. In foggy weather especially, Drivers needed immense concentration and route knowledge to handle trains safely through the night. Tonight, though, the weather remained calm. Thin mist lay low across fields beside the railway embankment, while the sky above stayed mostly clear. Occasionally, the moon emerged between drifting clouds and silvered the rails, stretching endlessly ahead. Telegraph wires rose and fell beside the track with hypnotic regularity, humming softly in the cold air whenever the wind shifted. The fireman leaned briefly from the cab again. The sensation always struck him, that strange contrast between worlds separated only by a few feet of metal and steam. Inside the cab, unbearable heat radiated from the firebox while machinery thundered beneath the floor plates. Outside, cold countryside slid silently past under moonlight and frost. The wind carried smells from the landscape as they traveled. Damp earth from ploughed fields, wood smoke from distant cottages, river water near bridges and marshes. Sometimes even the faint scent of sea air if the line passed coastal districts before dawn. Railwaymen came to know entire regions of the country, not through sightseeing or holidays, but through these brief sensory impressions gathered at speed during countless night journeys. Ahead, the line curved gently through a sleeping market town. Rows of terraced houses backed close against the railway embankment. Most windows remained dark, curtains drawn tightly against the night. Yet here and there a solitary light still burned in an upstairs room. Perhaps a nurse returning from late duty, a student reading beneath a lamp, a worried parent beside a sick child, or simply another worker awake through the night like the railwaymen themselves. The locomotive's whistle echoed sharply between the buildings. For a few seconds, the entire town seemed to stir faintly around the passing train. Bedroom curtains shifted. A dog barked somewhere in the darkness. Then the railway swept onward once more, carrying its brief disturbance away into the countryside beyond. Inside the coaches behind them, passengers slept through most of it entirely unaware. Night travel by steam train possessed its own peculiar atmosphere. Compartment lamps glowed softly above sleeping travelers wrapped in heavy coats and blankets. Carriage wheels rocked steadily beneath them, while occasional bursts of light from passing stations flashed briefly across luggage racks and polished wood panels. Porters had long since vanished from the platforms now. Many smaller stations stood entirely deserted at this hour, except for signalmen or overnight staff maintaining the line. Yet lamps still burned faithfully along the platforms, casting warm reflections across empty benches and damp paving stones as the express thundered through without stopping. The fireman scarcely noticed these stations anymore. His attention remained fixed upon the locomotive itself. He checked the water glass again. Water level remained healthy. Too high and steam space within the boiler became reduced. Too low and danger increased rapidly. Steam locomotives depended utterly upon maintaining correct water coverage above the firebox crown sheet. If exposed directly to intense heat without water cooling it properly, metal could weaken catastrophically. Railwaymen respected boilers deeply. Even experienced crews never entirely forgot the destructive force contained within them. Steam under pressure possessed terrifying power when mishandled. Boiler explosions, though relatively rare by the later steam era, remained among the most feared accidents imaginable upon the railways. The fireman adjusted the injector carefully. Steam hissed sharply as cold water forced into the boiler against internal pressure through ingenious engineering principles still remarkable today. The injector itself fascinated many railwaymen, a device using steam to force water into an already pressurized boiler without moving mechanical pumps. Steam seemed almost magical sometimes in the Victorian age. It powered factories, ships, pumping stations, mills, locomotives, and entire industrial cities. Yet inside the railway cab, the fireman dealt not with grand industrial theory, but with immediate practical realities: heat, water, pressure, fuel, labour, always labour. The train crossed another river now. Moonlight shimmered faintly upon dark, moving water below, while the bridge rang hollow beneath the wheels. Beyond the river stretched low meadows silvered with frost. In the distance stood the black outlines of trees and church towers against the night sky. For a few moments the fireman simply watched. There could be beauty in railway work, even amid exhaustion and grime. Many old railwaymen later spoke not only about hard labour, but about these quieter moments too. Dawn mist rising from valleys, stars above the cutting walls, distant factory lights reflected in rivers, snow falling silently upon sidings at 3 in the morning. The railway allowed men to witness landscapes at unusual hours when ordinary life disappeared and the country belonged almost entirely to darkness, weather, and moving trains. Then the locomotive lurched slightly beneath them. The driver adjusted the regulator. Another gradient approached ahead. Immediately the fireman returned to work. His shovel scraped once more against the tender floor. Coal scattered across the glowing firebed. The firebox roared brighter as fresh fuel caught within the draft. Far ahead, signals gleamed green through the darkness. The engine pressed onward into the sleeping countryside, while behind them the coaches swayed gently with dreaming passengers who would likely never know the effort required to carry them through the night. Part 6. Water Stop Before Dawn. By the time the night reached its deepest hours, even the locomotive itself seemed to grow weary. Not truly tired, of course, for machines do not feel exhaustion as men do, yet long journeys impose their own demands upon iron and steel. Bearings warmed, motion worked endlessly beneath strain and vibration. Coal vanished steadily into the firebox, while water levels slowly dropped within the boiler. Sooner or later, every steam locomotive needed to stop for water. And so, somewhere in the darkness before dawn, the driver eased the regulator close slightly, while the train began slowing upon the approach to a lonely wayside station. The change announced itself gradually. The fierce, hammering exhaust softened first, falling from a hard, urgent bark into slower measured beats. Wind noise faded around the cab. The wheels beneath them still sang against the rails, but now with less intensity than before. Ahead, platform lamps emerged one by one through the darkness, their pale yellow glow reflected faintly upon wet rails and drifting steam. The fireman set down his shovel for a moment. His shoulders ached now from hours of lifting coal. Every part of his clothing carried soot. Coal dust lay embedded in the creases of his hands despite sweat and repeated wiping against oily overalls. Yet there remained satisfaction too in surviving the long night's work so far. The boiler still steamed strongly. The fire burned bright and even. Pressure held steady beneath the driver's watchful eye. They had kept the engine alive through darkness. The train rolled gently alongside the platform. Most station buildings stood dark and silent at this hour. Waiting rooms were closed, booking offices locked. Posters along the walls curled slightly in the damp night air. Yet railway stations never seemed entirely asleep. Somewhere nearby, perhaps inside a signal box glowing softly above the tracks, another railwayman still remained awake, tending levers and instruments beneath shaded lamps. The locomotive finally stopped beside the water column. Steam drifted slowly around the platform edge. For a few moments, there was sudden stillness after so many miles of motion. Passengers stirred faintly inside the coaches behind them, some waking briefly as the brakes settled beneath the train. A compartment window slid open somewhere farther back. A sleepy face glanced out into the darkness before disappearing once more behind the glass. The fireman climbed carefully down from the cab onto the platform. Immediately the night air struck cold against his sweat-soaked clothes. After hours beside the blazing firebox, the cool dampness felt almost shocking. Above him, the locomotive towered huge and breathing in the darkness, safety valves feathering gently while warm metal clicked softly as temperatures shifted. At close range, steam engines always appeared more alive somehow. Heat shimmered faintly around pipes and cylinders. Condensation dripped steadily from motion and brake rigging onto the rails below. Small sounds emerged constantly from the machine. Hissing valves, bubbling water, creaking metal, escaping steam. The fireman walked toward the water crane. These tall, swinging columns once stood beside railway tracks all across Britain, silent guardians of the steam age. Some drew water from nearby tanks, others connected to pumping stations or elevated towers. Every locomotive crew depended upon them. Without water, steam power simply ceased to exist. He grasped the heavy metal arm and swung it slowly over the tender. Chains rattled softly. The crane groaned against its pivot. Then, with a sudden violent rush, water thundered downward into the tank below. The sound filled the silent station completely. Water splashed and steamed in the cold night air, while droplets scattered across the platform stones. The fireman watched carefully beneath the dim lamps, judging the rising level by experience more than sight. Overflow wasted precious time and water alike. Nearby, the driver leaned from the cab, speaking quietly with the signalman who had stepped briefly onto the platform from his box farther along the line. Railway conversations at such hours often remained practical and brief. Conditions ahead, freight delays, fog patches near the junction, perhaps a few remarks about weather or timings. Then silence returned again. The fireman stood beside the tender, listening to the enormous rushing sound of water filling the tank, while beyond the station lay complete countryside stillness. No motor traffic disturbed the roads nearby. No aircraft crossed overhead. Only the ticking locomotive, the splashing water, and distant wind moving through telegraph wires accompanied the darkness before dawn. Many railwaymen later remembered these pauses with surprising fondness. Not because the work became easier, it did not, but because water stops briefly interrupted the relentless rhythm of the journey. For a few precious minutes, men could stand still upon solid ground instead of balancing continuously upon the swaying footplate. The fireman rolled his shoulders slightly. Muscles stiffened quickly once the shoveling stopped. His back carried a dull ache now from repetitive labor. Steam railway firing demanded strength, but perhaps even more importantly, it demanded endurance. The ability to continue steady physical work hour after hour mattered far more than bursts of power. At last, the tank neared full. The fireman shut the valve firmly. The roaring water ceased almost instantly, leaving only dripping echoes beneath the platform roof. Steam curled upward through the lamplight while excess water splashed down beside the rails. He swung the crane slowly back into place. Farther down the platform, a guard's lamp moved briefly through the darkness. Somewhere inside the train, a compartment door slammed softly. The station clock showed an hour when most of the country lay deep in sleep. Yet the railway continued moving. It always continued moving. Mail trains carried letters through the night. Freight trains hauled coal, livestock, machinery, and food between distant towns and cities. Newspaper trains rushed toward London before dawn. Fish trains travelled inland from coastal ports. Milk trains carried churns collected from farms hours earlier. The railways possessed their own hidden nocturnal life, invisible to most ordinary people. The fireman climbed once more into the cab. Instant warmth returned around him as the firebox radiated heat across the footplate. The familiar smell of coal smoke, steam, and hot oil enclosed them again like a second atmosphere. He opened the fire door briefly and studied the glowing bed within. Still good. He added fresh coal carefully along thinner sections while the driver checked signals ahead. The locomotive, though paused only minutes, already seemed eager to move again. Steam pressure remained strong. White vapor drifted steadily from beneath the cylinders into the cold station air. Ahead, the signal arm lifted slowly. The line was clear. The driver answered with a low whistle that echoed mournfully across the sleeping countryside. Somewhere beyond the station buildings, perhaps in cottages near the line, a few sleepers turned faintly in their beds at the familiar sound before drifting back into dreams. The regulator opened gently. The locomotive tugged against the train once more. And slowly, beneath fading platform lamps and drifting steam, the fireman and driver carried their engine onward again into the darkness before dawn. Part 7. Fog on the line. Toward the final hours before dawn, weather often changed. Railwaymen knew this well. Clear skies earlier in the night could slowly vanish beneath drifting mist, rising from rivers and low meadows. Cold air settled into valleys. Moisture gathered upon rails, sleepers, signals, and telegraph wires. Sometimes fog arrived gradually, almost unnoticed at first. A slight whitening beside the embankments, a softening of distant lights, a damp heaviness entering the night air through the open cab. Then suddenly, the world beyond the locomotive disappeared. Tonight, the first signs came shortly after leaving the lonely water stop behind them. The fireman noticed the stars fading one by one above the cutting walls, while distant farm lights blurred strangely across the fields. Ahead, signal lamps no longer shone sharply through darkness, but glowed instead as soft-colored halos suspended within the mist. The driver noticed too. Without speaking much, he eased the regulator slightly and leaned farther from the cab side, peering ahead along the rails. Steam locomotives demanded respect in fog. Visibility could shrink alarmingly fast, especially across low countryside or near rivers. Even familiar routes became uncertain landscapes of drifting white darkness. The fireman continued working the fire, though now his attention divided between the boiler and the strange, changing world outside. Fog transformed the railway completely. Ordinary night running possessed rhythm and visibility. Signals approached steadily. Telegraph poles flickered past. Villages appeared and vanished across the landscape. But fog swallowed distance entirely. The locomotive no longer traveled through recognizable countryside. Instead, it moved through a small moving island of light and sound, surrounded by whiteness. The exhaust itself behaved differently. Steam no longer vanished cleanly upward into open air, but hung low around the engine, curling back along the train in thick clouds. Smoke drifted heavily beside the cab. Moisture settled instantly upon metal surfaces, coating handrails and gauges with fine droplets. The fireman wiped condensation from the pressure glass with the back of his sleeve. Ahead, the next signal emerged only gradually from the whiteness. Green. Good. The locomotive pressed onward. In earlier railway decades, fog represented one of the greatest dangers upon the line. Before modern signalling improvements, collisions occurred all too easily when visibility failed. Railway companies therefore developed elaborate fog working procedures involving detonators placed upon rails, fog signalmen stationed beside the track, and strict speed reductions during severe conditions. Even now, experienced crews treated fog cautiously. The driver listened almost as much as he looked. A steam locomotive communicated constantly through sound. The changing echo of exhaust beats against bridges, tunnel mouths, retaining walls or station buildings all revealed clues about surroundings hidden beyond visibility. Drivers learned routes so intimately that gradients, curves, and even particular stretches of rail became recognizable through sensation alone. The firemen admired this skill deeply. Older drivers especially sometimes seemed able to guide locomotives through darkness and fog almost by instinct. They knew every signal, crossing, incline and station, mile by mile across routes travelled thousands of times before. Still, fog always increased strain upon both men. Concentration sharpened. Signals had to be identified earlier and more carefully. Steam pressure needed maintaining despite slower running. Water levels still demanded attention. The fireman continued feeding the fire methodically while moisture settled steadily across his cap and shoulders from the drifting mist entering the cab. The locomotive whistle sounded again. In fog, whistles carried differently across the countryside, softer somehow, yet more haunting. The mournful note rolled outward through the whiteness and returned faintly in echoes from unseen embankments and trees. Far away, perhaps in cottages near the line, sleepers heard the sound through open bedroom windows and turned briefly beneath blankets before sleep reclaimed them. For generations, the distant whistle of night trains formed part of the soundscape of Britain itself, especially in towns and villages beside main railway routes. To many people, those sounds meant comfort, proof that the world still moved safely through darkness while they rested indoors. Few imagined the conditions upon the footplate at such hours. The fireman's clothes now carried layers of damp soot mixed with sweat and coal dust. Every surface in the cab felt gritty beneath the fingers. Fine cinders occasionally blew backward into the compartment despite the moisture-heavy air. His arms ached steadily from hours of firing, yet the work itself could never stop entirely. He opened the firebox door once more. The effect remained startling every time. Against the grey, wet fog outside, the fire within looked impossibly bright, a furious white-orange furnace roaring beneath the boiler. Heat burst outward violently into the cab, while the fireman spread fresh coal carefully across the glowing bed. For a few moments, the cab became an extraordinary contrast of elements. Behind them, cold, damp fog. Before them, roaring fire. Steam drifted everywhere between. The driver glanced at the pressure gauge again and gave a small approving nod. They were keeping good steam despite the difficult conditions. Outside, the railway line curved through low, marshy country where fog thickened even further. Telegraph poles vanished almost completely beyond a few yards. Signals appeared suddenly from the whiteness, glowing like suspended colored lanterns before slipping away again behind the train. Then came another sound, distant at first, soft. The fireman listened carefully. Another locomotive. Somewhere ahead and beyond the fog, an unseen train moved upon a neighboring line, its exhaust beats rolling faintly through the mist before fading once more into silence. Railways at night often possessed this strange hidden quality. Entire trains passed nearby, completely invisible except for brief sounds, drifting smoke, or distant signal changes. The railway world extended far beyond what crews could actually see. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fog began thinning again. Higher ground helped. The locomotive climbed gently now away from rivers and low meadows, while faint stars slowly reappeared overhead. Distant lights regained their sharpness. The rails ahead stretched farther into darkness once more, instead of vanishing immediately into white haze. The driver relaxed slightly. The fireman leaned briefly from the cab, breathing deeply of the cold air. Behind them, the coaches continued rocking gently through the night, carrying sleeping passengers toward destinations still hours away. Most never woke during the fog at all. They remained wrapped in blankets and dreams, while at the front of the train, the fireman and driver guided their great machine steadily onward through darkness, mist and moonlight toward the first pale signs of approaching dawn. Part 8. The First Light of Morning. At some point during every night journey, no matter how long or tiring, the darkness eventually began to loosen its grip upon the world. At first, the change was so slight that only those already awake for many hours tended to notice it. The sky remained dark overhead, the stars still visible between drifting clouds, and the countryside continued wrapped in shadow. Yet somewhere far beyond the eastern horizon, a faint softening slowly touched the edge of the night. Railwaymen became experts at recognizing these small changes. After hours spent beneath darkness, the eye learned to notice the very first hints of morning long before sunrise itself appeared. The black outlines of trees grew fractionally clearer against the sky. Fields beside the embankment separated gradually from the darkness surrounding them. Distant church towers and farm roofs emerged once more from shadow. The fireman noticed it while opening the firebox. For a moment, the orange glare from the flames no longer seemed the only source of light in the world. Beyond the cab, the horizon carried the faintest trace of grey-blue morning. Dawn was coming. The locomotive, meanwhile, continued its endless labor without concern for the hour. Steam pulsed steadily through cylinders and valves. Wheels hammered rhythmically over rail joints. Coal vanished steadily into the firebox, while the boiler breathed heat and pressure like some great mechanical animal alive beneath the crew's feet. The fireman's body ached now with the accumulated effort of the shift. Hours of firing had settled into his muscles heavily. His shoulders burned dully with fatigue. Every movement carried the stiffness that comes from repeated labor performed in heat, vibration, and cold air all at once. Yet strangely, many railwaymen remembered this final stretch before dawn as one of the most peaceful parts of the entire journey. Perhaps because survival itself now felt certain. The deepest darkness had passed. The long night's work had not defeated them. Ahead waited daylight, stations growing busier, and eventually the end of the run. The countryside changed with the coming light too. Villages that had appeared only as scattered lamps in darkness now slowly revealed themselves properly. Rows of cottages stood damp with morning dew. Fields stretched pale beneath low, drifting mist. Cows gathered quietly beside hedgerows, while thin smoke began rising from chimneys where early risers lit kitchen fires. The railway passed close behind small back gardens where washing lines hung motionless in the still air. A solitary milk cart moved along a distant lane. Somewhere a church clock struck softly across the fields. Ordinary life was beginning again. But the fireman and driver had already lived through an entire working night before most people opened their eyes. Inside the cab, conditions remained harsh despite the beauty of the approaching dawn. The firebox still radiated fierce heat whenever opened. Coal dust coated the footplate ankle deep in places. Steam condensed constantly upon cooler metal surfaces before dripping onto the floor below. The fireman's scarf and overalls felt heavy with soot and sweat. He scarcely noticed anymore. Railwaymen became accustomed to discomfort in the same gradual way sailors accepted salt spray or miners accepted coal dust. The conditions simply formed part of the work itself. Ahead, another station approached. Unlike the lonely water stop earlier in the night, this place already showed signs of waking activity. Lamps still burned beneath the platform canopy, but now figures moved beneath them carrying parcels, milk churns and newspapers. A porter wheeled a trolley along the platform edge, while a station master in dark coat and cap stood watching the approaching train through the pale morning light. The locomotive thundered through without stopping. For a few brief seconds the platform flashed past beside them, faces turning toward the engine, newspaper bundles stacked neatly beneath lamps, signal arms rising against the brightening sky. Then the station vanished behind them into drifting steam, and the open countryside returned once more. The fireman glanced briefly backward along the train. The coaches behind looked strangely peaceful in the dawn half-light. Curtains still hung across many compartment windows where passengers remained asleep. Other travelers had begun waking slowly, their faces appearing briefly behind glass as they looked out upon the misty fields rolling past. Some would soon arrive at busy city stations and continue ordinary working days. Few would ever think deeply about the men who had carried them safely through the night. Steam railway work often possessed this curious invisibility. Passengers noticed the convenience, speed and punctuality of trains, yet rarely the physical effort hidden within their operation. Entire journeys depended upon unseen labor, performed in darkness by crews covered in soot and sweat. The fireman lifted his shovel again. Even near journey's end, the locomotive still required careful management. A common mistake among inexperienced crews was allowing concentration to slip during the final hours of a run. Yet steam engines demanded attention until the very last mile. Pressure still needed maintaining. Water levels remained critical. The fire had to stay healthy enough for station approaches, junctions, and any final climbs ahead. He spread another layer of coal carefully across the glowing firebed. The flames responded immediately, brightening deep within the boiler tubes, while heat rushed through the cab again. Outside, the eastern sky now carried definite color. Soft silver near the horizon, then pale blue above it. Clouds overhead slowly emerged from darkness, their edges touched faintly by approaching sunrise. Telegraph wires beside the line gleamed wet with dew, while pools and rivers reflected the growing light like polished steel. Birdsong began appearing too. At first, only isolated calls from hedgerows beside the embankment. Then gradually more voices joined until the countryside itself seemed to wake around the passing train. The contrast always struck night railwaymen strongly. Only an hour earlier, the world had belonged almost entirely to darkness, steam and machinery. Now suddenly, life returned everywhere. Birds moving through trees, smoke rising from cottages, workers cycling along lanes toward factories and farms. The train crossed another bridge. Below, a river drifted pale beneath the morning mist, while narrowboats rested motionless against the bank. Farther beyond stood rows of industrial buildings where tall chimneys already released thin streams of smoke into the brightening sky. The city approached. The driver adjusted the regulator carefully while watching signals ahead, growing more frequent now. Sidings multiplied beside the main line. Freight wagons appeared in long rows beyond the embankments. Other locomotives moved through the morning haze, hauling commuter trains toward busy terminals. The railway world was waking fully again. Soon the long, quiet miles of countryside running would end, replaced by crowded junctions, signals, whistles and platforms, alive with early morning passengers. But for now, for a few final, peaceful miles beneath the growing dawn, the fireman remained beside his glowing firebox, while the steam locomotive carried them steadily onward through the waking world. Part 9. Arrival in the city. By the time full morning finally arrived, the railway had changed completely. The lonely countryside miles of the night were behind them now. Gone were the isolated stations standing silent beneath moonlight, the dark meadows silvered with frost, and the long stretches where the locomotive seemed alone in the sleeping world. Ahead lay the great outer edges of the city, already alive with movement, smoke, signals and noise. The fireman noticed the change first through the tracks themselves. What had been 2 running lines across open country slowly widened into 4, then 6, then more still. Sidings spread outward beside warehouses and factories. Rows of freight wagons stood waiting in marshalling yards darkened by soot and damp morning mist. Signal gantries crossed overhead, carrying clusters of colored lamps and semaphore arms above the growing web of rails. Everything became busier. Other trains appeared constantly now. Commuter engines hurried inward carrying clerks, typists, laborers and shop workers toward the city center. Freight locomotives crawled slowly through sidings, dragging endless wagons of coal, timber, meat, machinery and parcels. Tank engines fussed back and forth between junctions while whistles echoed continuously beneath the pale morning sky. The railway no longer belonged to the quiet night crews alone. Day had reclaimed it. Yet the fireman and driver had already completed an entire shift before most commuters even reached the platforms. The locomotive itself looked transformed by the journey. What may once have left the shed polished and prepared now carried the clear marks of long overnight labor. Soot streaked backward along the boiler. Condensation mixed with coal dust around the cab and tender. Ash lay scattered across the footplate, while warm oil glistened darkly around moving parts beneath the running boards. The fireman looked little cleaner. His face remained blackened except where sweat had carved pale tracks through the soot. Coal dust clung to his sleeves and collar. Tiny burns marked places where sparks or cinders had landed during the journey. His hands, despite repeated wiping, seemed stained, permanently dark from the night's work. Still, the locomotive steamed strongly. That mattered most. Many railwaymen judged themselves not by appearance or comfort, but by whether they brought the train in on time with healthy steam and a willing engine beneath them. Pride in competent work ran deeply through railway culture, even if outsiders rarely noticed it. Ahead, the signals checked them briefly approaching a major junction. The driver eased the regulator closed, while the locomotive slowed beneath a forest of semaphore arms, signal posts, telegraph wires, and iron bridges crossing overhead. Nearby, another express moved parallel beside them for several moments, its own locomotive pounding steadily through clouds of white steam before diverging toward different platforms farther ahead. The fireman took the opportunity to tidy the fire slightly. A good crew aimed to arrive at the terminus with the engine still in proper condition, rather than exhausted or badly handled. He spread remaining coal carefully across thinner sections of the grate and checked the water level once more. The firebox still glowed fiercely despite the long night's work. Steam locomotives rarely rested completely until the very end. The junction cleared, signals lifted. The driver answered with a brief whistle before easing the regulator open again. Now the city surrounded them fully. Rows of terraced houses stretched endlessly beside the line, their chimneys pouring smoke into the cool morning air. Washing lines crossed tiny back gardens. Children stood on bridges above the railway, waving excitedly at passing locomotives. Factory workers hurried along streets beside canals and warehouses, while delivery carts rattled across cobbles already busy with morning trade. To many people living beside railway lines, steam locomotives formed part of everyday life itself. They woke to whistles before dawn. They measured time by commuter trains. Children learned to recognize different engines from bedroom windows and bridge parapets. Entire neighborhoods carried the smell of coal smoke drifting constantly from nearby railways. For the fireman, though, the city often meant something else entirely: the end of the run. Fatigue settled heavier now that arrival approached. During the long night, constant work and concentration kept tiredness partly at bay. But nearing the terminus allowed exhaustion to creep fully into awareness. His arms felt heavier with every movement. His back ached deeply from hours upon the swaying footplate. Even the heat from the firebox now seemed more draining than invigorating. Still, there remained work to finish. Ahead, the great station roof finally emerged through steam and smoke. Massive iron arches stretched across dozens of platforms beneath glass, darkened by decades of soot. Signals clustered thickly outside the station throat, while locomotives moved everywhere through drifting vapor and echoing whistles. The sound changed immediately as they entered. Every exhaust beat now rolled thunderously beneath the roof, before echoing back from iron, glass, and stone. Steam hung trapped high overhead in pale clouds beneath the girders. Porters hurried along platforms beside luggage barrows, while station announcements echoed indistinctly through the vast enclosed space. The locomotive slowed steadily. Passengers inside the coaches began fully waking now. Compartment doors opened, newspapers folded, hats adjusted. Travelers gathered luggage from racks, while the train rolled carefully toward its assigned platform beneath the enormous roof. The fireman leaned briefly from the cab side. Platform faces slipped slowly past beside them, crowded now with commuters, porters, station staff, and waiting relatives. Coffee stalls released the smell of tea and warm bread into the smoky station air. Somewhere nearby, another engine released steam with a violent roar that vanished upward into the rafters. At last, with one final gentle application of brakes, the train came to rest. For a few moments there was stillness, then immediately the station came alive around them. Doors slammed open along the coaches. Porters called to one another across the platform. Footsteps echoed beneath the roof while passengers poured outward carrying cases, newspapers, umbrellas and parcels into the busy morning city beyond. Few looked toward the locomotive crew. Perhaps a child glanced upward briefly at the towering engine breathing steam beside the platform. Perhaps an elderly traveler nodded faint thanks toward the driver leaning from the cab, but most passengers simply continued onward into their ordinary day. The fireman watched them quietly. After all the labor of the night, the heat, coal dust, fog, gradients, water stops, and endless shoveling, there could be something oddly satisfying about this moment. Hundreds of people had traveled safely through darkness while sleeping, reading, or dreaming behind the locomotive, and now they had arrived. The driver climbed stiffly down from the cab onto the platform. The fireman followed more slowly. His legs felt strange after so many hours balancing upon the moving footplate. The station air seemed cold now, away from the firebox heat, despite the growing warmth of morning beyond the glass roof. Behind them, The locomotive still hissed and breathed softly beside the platform, alive for a little while longer before its own long day of work continued. Part 10. Back to the shed. For the passengers, the journey ended beneath the great station roof. They stepped out into the noise and movement of the waking city, carrying bags, newspapers, briefcases and umbrellas. Within minutes, most disappeared entirely into streets, offices, tramcars, taxis, factories and shops. The overnight train became only another ordinary part of the morning, scarcely thought about again. But for the locomotive crew, the work was not yet finished. Far from it. A steam engine could not simply be abandoned at the platform and forgotten. Even after a long night upon the road, the locomotive still required care, attention, cleaning and preparation before another crew might take it out again later in the day. The railway never truly stopped. The fireman stood for a moment beside the engine while the last passengers drifted away along the platform. Morning light filtered weakly through the soot-darkened glass roof overhead, turning the drifting steam pale gold in places. Around them, the station roared with activity now. Porters hurried with barrows stacked high with luggage and mailbags. Whistles echoed constantly between platforms. Nearby locomotives hissed, clanked and thundered beneath the great iron arches. Yet after the long, quiet miles of the night countryside, the noise felt strangely distant to him. Fatigue softened everything slightly. His body ached with the heavy dullness that comes after sustained labor. Coal dust clung stubbornly to every fold of his clothing. Even his eyelids felt gritty from smoke and soot. Still, routine carried him onward automatically, just as it had throughout the night. The driver exchanged a few words with station staff while the fireman checked the fire one more time. Inside the firebox, the great glowing bed still burned fiercely, though lower now than during the hardest stretches of the journey. Heat radiated outward against his face as he opened the heavy iron door. The fire had sustained them through darkness, gradients, fog, and miles of countryside. Soon, it too would finally be allowed to rest. But not quite yet. The locomotive needed moving away from the platform first. Fresh crews waited elsewhere. Other trains required space beneath the crowded station roof. Railways depended upon constant motion and careful timing, especially in busy city terminals where engines arrived and departed almost endlessly throughout the day. The driver climbed back into the cab. With a short whistle and a soft release of steam, the locomotive moved slowly forward once more, leaving the empty coaches behind at the platform. Now, without the heavy train coupled behind them, the engine felt different beneath the footplate. Lighter somehow, more responsive. Exhaust beats sounded sharper as they rolled carefully through points and sidings toward the servicing roads beyond the station. The fireman leaned briefly from the cab side. Morning had fully arrived outside now. Beyond the station throat, the city stretched outward beneath pale sunlight and low drifting smoke. Rows of chimneys released coal smoke into the cool air. Factory sirens sounded faintly in the distance. Streets filled steadily with workers beginning ordinary days, many entirely unaware that the men upon this locomotive had already been awake and laboring since long before dawn. That separation between railway time and ordinary time formed a peculiar part of the job. Night railwaymen often felt slightly detached from the rest of society. They saw towns asleep when others knew them only busy and crowded. They witnessed dawn arriving across empty fields while most people still lay in bed. Meals happened at strange hours. Sleep came during daylight. Entire shifts passed while the rest of the world dreamed. The locomotive rolled across a complex maze of sidings toward the engine depot. Here, the railway revealed its hidden industrial heart once again. Coal stages towered above the tracks. Water cranes stood ready beside ash pits and inspection roads. Engines waited everywhere, some freshly prepared for duty, others filthy and exhausted after overnight freight runs. Men moved constantly through the steam, carrying oil cans, tools, lamps and shovels, while foremen shouted instructions across the noise. Nothing about a steam railway was effortless. Modern people sometimes remember the steam era through polished preservation engines gliding peacefully through countryside stations. Yet the reality of working railways was far more industrial, noisy, dirty, and physically demanding. Vast numbers of workers labored continuously behind the scenes simply to keep locomotives moving each day. The fireman climbed down beside the ash pit. One final unpleasant task remained. During operation, ash and clinker gradually collected beneath the fire grate. These hot remains needed removing before the locomotive could properly rest or be prepared for another journey. It was filthy work, often performed while the engine still radiated fierce heat from the boiler and firebox. The fireman opened the lower fire grate carefully. Almost immediately, glowing ash tumbled downward into the pit below with a rush of sparks and heat. Smoke drifted upward around him while the smell of hot cinders filled the morning air. Using long iron tools, he broke apart stubborn clinker deposits and cleared remaining ash from beneath the fire. Even now, after an entire night's labor, the work demanded care. Steam locomotives punished laziness quickly. Improper cleaning reduced efficiency. Neglected maintenance caused failures upon the line. Every crew inherited the condition left by the previous one, and railwaymen remembered careless workers with irritation lasting years. At last, the worst of the ash dropped clear. The fire itself would either be cleaned fully or banked carefully depending upon whether the engine remained in service later that day. Some locomotives barely rested at all between duties during busy periods. The fireman wiped sweat and soot from his forehead with an already blackened sleeve. Nearby, another crew prepared an engine for departure. Fresh coal crashed into a tender from overhead chutes while steam drifted through the morning sunlight in enormous white clouds. Somewhere beyond the depot, whistles echoed continuously from the busy station approaches. The railway day had fully begun, and yet for this crew, the shift neared its end. The driver completed final paperwork inside the depot office while the fireman cleaned tools and gathered his belongings from the cab. The locomotive beside him ticked softly now as metal cooled unevenly after hours of hard running. Without the fierce urgency of the journey, the engine suddenly seemed almost peaceful again. The fireman paused beside the footplate before leaving. There was pride here. Not grand dramatic pride perhaps, but the quieter satisfaction that came from difficult work completed properly. Through darkness and fog, through cold night air and unbearable firebox heat, they had brought the train safely across the country while hundreds slept behind them. Most passengers would never know the effort required. That did not matter greatly to railwaymen. Much of their work had always been invisible. Signals changed quietly in distant boxes. Permanent way gangs repaired rails before dawn. Porters loaded milk and newspapers while towns slept. And inside the locomotive cab itself, the fireman continued hour after hour, feeding coal into the glowing furnace that kept the entire train alive. Outside the depot, the morning city carried on almost indifferently. Factory workers hurried through streets. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Children walked to school beside smoky railway bridges. Ordinary life moved forward beneath pale skies and drifting chimney smoke. And somewhere, after washing away as much soot as possible and eating a long overdue breakfast, the fireman would finally return home to sleep while the rest of the world remained fully awake. Part 11. The Last Years of Steam. By the final years of the steam railway age, many firemen already understood that their world was beginning to disappear. Not all at once, of course. Railways changed slowly. For a long time, steam locomotives still seemed eternal. They remained everywhere, beneath station roofs, inside smoky engine sheds, crossing viaducts, standing beside water towers, hauling freight through industrial towns, and roaring across open countryside, beneath drifting clouds of steam. Entire cities still smelled faintly of coal smoke from railways alone. And yet, little by little, another kind of locomotive began appearing beside them, cleaner, quieter, more modern. Diesel engines arrived first in small numbers, often viewed with suspicion by older railwaymen. To many crews raised upon steam, these new machines seemed strangely lifeless. They required no fire to build before dawn, no shoveling, no careful balancing of steam and water. A driver could simply start the engine and move away. For older firemen especially, this felt almost unnatural. Much of their hard-earned skill suddenly seemed unnecessary. A steam fireman spent years learning the moods of locomotives, how different coal burned, how weather affected drafting, how to prepare for difficult gradients, how to maintain pressure without wasting fuel, how to read a fire by color alone. These were not small accomplishments. They formed a deeply practical craft passed quietly from one generation of railwaymen to the next. And now, gradually, the craft itself was fading. In the great engine sheds across Britain, changes became visible first through absence. Fewer locomotives stood beneath the roofs. Some sidings fell silent. Water towers no longer worked constantly through the night. Coal stages emptied more slowly than before. Certain sheds closed entirely, their vast interiors left echoing and dark, except for pigeons drifting through broken roof panels high above the rails. The atmosphere changed too. For more than a century, railway depots had possessed their own unmistakable smell. Steam, smoke, hot oil, coal dust, damp ash, and warm metal. Men carried those smells home upon their clothes after every shift. Entire railway districts lived beneath drifting soot from locomotive chimneys. Then, gradually, the smoke began thinning. By the 1960s especially, many lines once alive with steam became strangely clean and quiet almost overnight. Diesel locomotives waited where great steam engines had stood only years before. Engine sheds that once glowed orange with firelight before dawn fell cold and silent. Some railwaymen adapted willingly enough, others did not. Many older crews missed the physical rhythm of steam work despite its hardships. Strange though it may seem, there had been satisfaction in the labor itself. A steam locomotive demanded cooperation between men and machine. The driver and fireman worked together continuously, balancing power, heat, water, fuel, weather, and timing hour after hour across the railway network. Diesels changed that relationship completely. No more building the fire before dawn. No more injector hiss in the night. No more shower of sparks streaming backward beneath the stars. No more long pauses at water columns in lonely stations before morning. And perhaps most strangely of all, no more firemen. The role itself began disappearing. For generations, the fireman had been essential to railway operation. Entire careers began with the shovel. Young railwaymen learned discipline, endurance, and locomotive handling from the footplate upward. Many future drivers spent years firing engines before promotion. Now suddenly, the position seemed uncertain. Some firemen retrained, others retired early, Some simply left the railways altogether. Across Britain, men who had spent entire working lives beside roaring fireboxes watched their profession vanish within little more than a decade. Yet even during those final years, steam locomotives retained extraordinary power over the imagination. Children still gathered beside bridges to watch expresses thunder beneath trailing smoke across the countryside. Platform ends filled with enthusiasts carrying notebooks and cameras, hoping to record disappearing engines before they vanished forever. Ordinary travellers still paused to watch locomotives depart beneath station roofs, wrapped in clouds of steam and noise. There was something deeply alive about steam railways. Even people who disliked the soot, noise and dirt often admitted that diesel engines seemed emotionally colder by comparison. Steam locomotives breathed visibly. They announced their effort through sound and movement. A hard-working engine climbing a gradient appeared almost heroic in its labor, exhaust hammering against the hills while firelight flickered inside the cab. And always, beside that firelight, stood the fireman, sweating in winter, shoveling in rhythm, keeping the boiler alive, keeping the train moving through darkness. Many of the old railwaymen later spoke less about machinery than about atmosphere. The glow of engine sheds before dawn, the smell of rain striking hot metal, the silence of country stations at 3 in the morning, fog drifting through signal lamps, tea drunk from battered flasks while waiting in sidings, the strange companionship of working through nights while most of the world slept. Steam railway life had never been comfortable. Yet, to those who belonged to it, the disappearance of that world felt deeply personal. Even today, long after regular steam vanished from most railways, certain traces still remain if one looks carefully enough. Old water towers survive beside abandoned lines. Disused engine sheds stand hidden behind modern warehouses. Railway cottages still back onto embankments where night expresses once thundered past. Sometimes, on preserved railways, one may still glimpse something of the old atmosphere returning briefly. A locomotive waits breathing softly beneath evening light while coal smoke drifts across quiet stations. Firebox glow flickers inside the cab. Somewhere a whistle echoes through the countryside exactly as it did generations earlier. And for a moment, the lost world returns. One can almost imagine the fireman there again beside the tender, blackened with soot beneath the glow of the firebox, preparing for another long night journey through sleeping towns and mist-covered fields, a world of steam, a world of labor, a world now mostly vanished into memory and drifting smoke. Part 12, The Quiet Railway After Dark. And now, as our long journey beside the footplate slowly comes to its end, the railway itself begins to grow quiet once more. The busy morning station has faded behind us. The crowds have dispersed into offices, factories, shops and streets. The overnight train that carried sleeping passengers across the country has already been cleaned, re-marshalled or sent elsewhere down the line. Signals continue rising and falling. Freight still moves through distant yards. Somewhere, another locomotive prepares for departure. But here, for a little while, we step away from the noise of the day. We return instead to the quieter railway world that existed beyond ordinary notice, the hidden hours between midnight and dawn when steam locomotives traveled through sleeping landscapes beneath moonlight, fog, rain and stars. It is evening again now. The station lamps are beginning to glow one by one beneath darkening skies. Somewhere beyond the platforms, an engine shed breathes softly in the dusk, while thin smoke drifts upward into the cooling air. The daytime rush is fading. Porters move more slowly, voices echo gently beneath iron roofs. Far down the line, a locomotive whistle sounds, long, low, mournful. For generations, sounds like these belonged to the night itself. People lying awake in distant cottages heard them drifting across valleys after midnight. Children listened from bedroom windows while goods trains rolled unseen through darkness beyond the town. Travelers wrapped in blankets aboard sleeping expresses woke briefly as engines thundered through lonely stations before vanishing once more into the night. And always at the front of the train, there were men awake beside the fire. The steam railway fireman belonged to a world built upon repetition and endurance. Night after night, season after season, he performed the same difficult labor beneath wildly different skies. Summer heat inside the cab, winter frost upon the rails, rain sweeping sideways through open footplates, fog swallowing signal lamps, snow settling softly across sidings and silent platforms. Yet still, the trains moved. Mail arrived before morning. Milk reached the cities. Passengers slept their way across the country. Newspapers traveled through darkness toward breakfast tables not yet awake. The railway connected sleeping Britain together hour by hour, while most people never saw the work taking place. There is something strangely comforting about that thought. Somewhere, while lamps glowed faintly behind curtains and families slept indoors, unseen railwaymen continued quietly tending signals, coupling wagons, checking points, trimming lamps, and feeding fires beneath the stars. The world did not stop simply because darkness arrived, and perhaps that is partly why old steam railways still linger so powerfully in memory. Not merely because of nostalgia, nor because locomotives looked beautiful beneath clouds of steam, but because they represented a slower, more human rhythm of work. Steam demanded patience, preparation, skill, cooperation. Nothing happened instantly. A locomotive could not simply awaken at the press of a button. Men arrived hours before departure to clean fires, oil motion, fill tenders, raise steam, and prepare machines carefully for the road ahead. Journeys unfolded gradually through labor, timing, and experience. Even speed itself felt different then. Passengers sensed distance passing beneath them through the rhythm of wheels, the sway of coaches, and the changing sounds of the engine ahead. At night especially, steam trains seemed almost dreamlike. Islands of warmth and light moving steadily through immense darkness, while fields, rivers, villages, and sleeping stations drifted silently by outside. Inside the locomotive cab, meanwhile, the fireman continued his endless work. Shovel lifting from tender, fire door opening, orange light flooding the footplate, coal scattering across the glowing bed. Again and again through the long hours before dawn. Many people today would likely find the work unbearable. The heat, the soot, the noise, the exhaustion. Yet countless men performed it for decades with little complaint because difficult physical work formed an ordinary part of life for much of the industrial age. Railwaymen, miners, dock workers, foundry laborers, sailors, and factory hands all lived inside worlds of smoke, grime, heat, and machinery now largely vanished from modern daily experience. And perhaps because those worlds have disappeared, they now seem almost unreal, like distant weather remembered from childhood. Yet they were real. Entire generations built their lives around such labor. Tonight, though, we leave them gently where they belong, within the drifting steam and half-light of memory. The railway after dark grows quieter now. Signals continue shining steadily beside empty tracks. Somewhere an engine cools slowly beside a shed wall, metal ticking softly after a long day upon the road. Far away, Another night crew signs on beneath yellow lamps, while the smell of coal smoke drifts once more through the darkness. Perhaps the fireman lifts his shovel again. Perhaps a driver checks his watch beneath the glow of the gauge lamps. Perhaps somewhere beyond the station throat, a waiting locomotive breathes softly into the cold night air, while passengers settle sleepily into compartments behind it. Soon the whistle will sound. Soon the train will move out into darkness once more. And once again, while towns and villages sleep peacefully beneath the night sky, the steam railway fireman will stand beside the glowing firebox, keeping alive the great warm heart of the engine as it carries its sleeping train onward through the quiet world before dawn. Epilogue: the distant whistle. And now the railway grows distant. The station lamps fade softly into the night behind us. Steam drifts upward beneath dark skies before disappearing into the cold air. Somewhere far away beyond fields, rivers, rooftops and sleeping towns, a locomotive whistle echoes faintly one final time. Then silence returns. The fireman's long shift is over now. His shovel rests quietly against the tender. The firebox door remains closed, its fierce orange glow hidden once more behind iron and steel. Somewhere inside the engine shed, cooling locomotives tick softly in the darkness, while thin wisps of steam curl upward toward soot-blackened rafters. Outside, dawn has long since passed into morning. Ordinary life continues. Shops open their doors. Factory whistles call workers onto the streets. Children hurry toward schools beside railway bridges. Commuters crowd platforms without much thought for the labor that carried them there through the night. And yet, for just a little while tonight, we stepped into that hidden world. A world of glowing fireboxes and drifting fog, of signal lamps shining through darkness, of cold air rushing past the cab while sparks vanished upward into the stars. A world where unseen men worked patiently through the small hours while most of the country slept warm in bed. The steam railway fireman rarely appeared in photographs as the hero of the journey. Attention usually settled upon the locomotive itself, polished brass, towering wheels, clouds of steam rolling magnificently across viaducts and stations. Yet behind every successful night run stood the quiet labor of the man beside the fire, hour after hour, shovelful after shovelful, keeping the pressure steady, keeping the engine alive, keeping the train moving onward through darkness. Perhaps that is why old steam railways still feel strangely comforting even now, long after most of them disappeared from ordinary life. They remind us of a slower world built not upon instant convenience, but upon rhythm, patience, endurance, and human effort quietly repeated through the night. There is comfort, too, in imagining that hidden network still existing somewhere beyond sleep. Signals changing faithfully in lonely boxes, distant lamps beside silent tracks, a locomotive breathing softly beneath stars, the low murmur of wheels upon rails far away in darkness. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the edge of hearing, the fireman still stands upon the swaying footplate beneath the glow of the firebox, carrying his sleeping passengers gently onward through the quiet countryside before dawn. So now, as the last of the steam drifts upward and disappears into the night sky, we leave the railway behind us. The engine shed doors close softly. The signals return to darkness. The distant whistle fades, and the long journey through the night finally comes to rest. And I, Mr. Norman Pepper, wish for you a pleasant night's sleep.